Thanks for staying with us on The Real Story. It's a big election year, and one of the highest profile races will be the race for U.S. Senate. Senator Richard Blumenthal running for re-election, and there's a lot of interest on the Republican side. One of the candidates is no stranger to running in our state. Republican Peter Lumaj is hoping he will face Senator Blumenthal in the general election. Lumaj is an attorney who has run for statewide office before. In 2014, he ran for Secretary of the State, and in 2018, he had aspirations to run for governor, but ended up pulling out of the race after the party's nominating convention. Mr. Lumaj has a unique background. He came to this country as a refugee from Albania, and now, no doubt, that has shaped how he sees the world and his views on policy. So we want to welcome back to The Real Story, Mr. Peter Lumaj. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
You know, I was, doing my research for this interview, and I was looking back, and the last time I think we had you on was 2014. You and I did an interview where you were running for Secretary of the State. So I was able to listen back on that. But I want to talk about first, in case people don't know your background, you came here as a refugee from Albania. How has that shaped your worldview?
Well, what happened is 32 years ago, my brothers and I escaped communist Albania. And at that time, anyone who dared to even think about escaping the country would have been either executed or imprisoned for a long time. But we always believed that we have a God-given right to search for freedom and opportunity, and we took that risk. The moment we left Albania, government agents, they rounded up my family, took them into a concentration camp, and they tortured my father to death. I always tell people that I believe that my father was willing to sacrifice his life so my brothers and I could live in freedom. And that shaped my perception of what it means to be an American. That shaped my perception of what it means to be a conservative, to conserve or preserve what's good. And what's good about America is the founding documents of this country, is the Declaration of Independence, which clearly states that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are pretty much God-given rights, where we are endowed by the Creator with those rights. And then you have a Constitution which limits the government. It has enumerated powers when it comes to the government to make sure that the individual remains free. And that's why I shape myself or my views as a conservative, because I firmly believe that we have to preserve and conserve what's good about this country.
Well, I'm certainly so sorry to hear about your father. That is absolutely awful. Tell us why you wanted to run for U.S. Senate. Why this position?
Well, the U.S. Senate, I believe, is the final battleground, actually, to defeat the socialist agenda that is approaching this country. Whether we like it or not, there are certain groups in this country that they would love to embrace socialism. And one of them being Blumenthal. I'm not saying that he's a communist, but he had the audacity of attending the Communist Party USA convention, or when they had the anniversary. And to quote him, he said that he was elated to be there and proud of the work that he did. Now, to be fair, he apologized a few days later, and he said that he didn't know that he was attending such an event.
Right.
But then we have other elected officials, such as Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, and others, actually, who are cheerfully embracing a failed ideology which has caused so much misery and suffering in the world. And when I hear these elected officials who got elected and got sworn in to uphold, defend, and protect the Constitution, and yet the moment they get elected, they are willing to trash and throw that Constitution out of the window, that is a concern that I have for generations to come. First of all, I don't need a job. I'm an attorney. I have my own practice. I have my own business. I'm living the American dream. But the American dream that I found here 32 years ago is under attack, and I fear that my kids are not going to be able to live in the same freedoms and opportunities that I found here 32 years ago. And that is why this midterm election is so significant, because the U.S. Senate is going to be the only entity in Washington that can shape the president's agenda. And what I mean by that, the U.S. Senate, or the senators, are the ones who will be able to advise and consent the president of the Supreme Court nominations, the Federal Reserve, which is destroying our currency. Look at the inflation, the currency depreciation, confiscatory taxation that we have. So the United States Senate and the senators senators themselves are the ones who are going to shape this president's agenda, even when it comes to international treaties and deal with international affairs such as the Ukraine right now, the situation in Ukraine. So that's why nominating someone who understands the definition of what it means to be a U.S. senator and how to approach the challenges that our nation is facing, I think is going to be significant for the Republican Party and for our state to elect someone like me to the United States Senate.
All right, so let's talk about, obviously with your background as a refugee, we have the crisis in Ukraine, we have this war going on. Give us a brief overview of what you think about U.S. policy and what needs to be done, not just U.S. policy, but also Western policy.
Well, if we go back to Reagan, at one point he said that I would rather be feared than respected. The current administration is neither feared nor respected. And this is why Putin actually took such an action after the previous administration was no longer in power. He did the same thing in 2014 when he took Crimea. At that time, we had President Obama, and the current president was the vice president of the United States. So what happened over here, he noticed that there is some weakness in our administration, and he took advantage of it. This ideology that we call socialism and communism is not dead in Eastern Europe. There is a movement by Russia to reestablish such an empire, if that's what you want to call it, which is the communist or the socialist empire that they had until 1990. So if the United States and the West are not going to stand up and provide assistance to the Ukrainian people, I think that the Russian movement is going to expand to Eastern Europe. Now, if Russia were to stop fighting right now, the war would be over. But if Ukrainians were to stop fighting, Ukraine will no longer exist. So the United States and the Western powers, they do have an obligation to supply the weapons that are needed and the training that is needed for the Ukrainian people to fight this war. They have surprised the world, the Ukrainians, with their decisive character and fortitude to fight the Russians. And if we provide them with the armament that they need, they can win this war on their own.
So you think that the U.S. hasn't done enough? Obviously, we've done economic sanctions. There have been weapons and support provided to the country.
Well, the sanctions that we imposed on Russia, actually, they haven't become effective yet. They become effective in the future. But the sanctions, even the current administration admits that they are not going to defeat Putin. What we need, I think that this is a wake-up call for the West. And what I mean by that is that the West can no longer depend on Russia to supply certain, such as gas, to the Western Europe, including Germany. This is the time that we have to wake up as Americans, and the administration is going to have to become much more independent from Russia when it comes to gas production, other things that we may import from Russia. So that this is a wake-up call for the West and Russia, United States, that we cannot depend on Russia, at least under the current administration that they have under Putin, who is openly a former KGB agent who has aspirations to reestablish the greatness of, if that's what you want to call it, for Russia again.
Yep, that's what our previous guest was discussing as well. Peter Lumaj, running for U.S. Senate this time around. Thanks so much for coming back on The Real Story.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
All right, that does it for us on The Real Story. If you want to watch these segments again, you can head to fox61.com or download the Fox 61 app and watch The Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61. Have a great morning.